The Forgotten Race. The Kareth were once a people who filled the stars with their music and their craft. Their cities shone like jewels in the void, and their voices carried across the great councils of the galaxy. Yet those times were long gone, and the fires of their civilization had burned down to nothing more than ash and smoke. Their homeworld had been poisoned slowly by greed, stripped of its life by wars they could not win and industries they did not control. And when they cried out for help, the great empires of the stars looked away. The Galactic Council had met, many times to speak of the Kareth, but always the decision was the same. They were considered a lost cause, a race whose decline was inevitable, and no empire wished to waste its treasure or its armies to save them. In the end, the Council declared their fate sealed and withdrew all aid, leaving the Kareth to fade into silence. On the broken plains of their homeworld, the last Kareth gathered, living in crumbling shelters, surviving on scraps of food and contaminated water, their bodies thin and their eyes hollow. Mothers watched their children grow weaker each day, and warriors who once fought proudly now stared at the ground in despair. The skies above them were gray with ash and storms that carried poisons across the land, yet still they clung to life, not because they believed they would be saved, but because they did not know how to stop breathing, even when the act itself brought pain. They told each other stories of their ancestors, but even those stories had begun to feel like lies. For how could such a mighty people have fallen so low and been forgotten so quickly? Every ship that passed their system ignored their signals. Every plea was dismissed. Among the Kareth there was a saying whispered in the night, that the galaxy itself had turned its back and that their gods had gone silent. No one expected anyone to come, for what value could there be in helping a people marked for death by the Council? Days stretched into weeks and weeks into years, and the Kareth felt time grinding them away like dust under a storm. Then came a day unlike any before, when the watchmen in the old towers saw something bright break through the clouds of their poisoned sky. A ship was descending, not the cold black vessels of the Council nor the sharp and cruel frigates of raiders, but something unfamiliar. Its hull gleamed with lines that seemed alive. Its engines roared with a steady power, and its banner carried no alien crest that the Kareth recognized. Fear and suspicion spread among them, for every arrival in the past had brought more suffering, and they expected that this too would be a cruel trick, or perhaps the final blow to finish their people. The ship landed on the outskirts of their largest ruined city, and from its belly stepped figures unlike those they had seen before. They were taller in some ways, shorter in others. Their skin varied from pale to dark, their clothing strong but not decorated with the arrogance of conquerors. They moved with a strange confidence, and their eyes carried something that the Kareth had not seen in generations, a spark that burned not with contempt but with determination. These were humans, a race that the Kareth had heard of only in whispers, newcomers to the galaxy, a people regarded as reckless, stubborn, and unpredictable. The Kareth elders gathered, their bodies frail and their voices trembling, to meet these strangers. They demanded to know why they had come, and what price they would ask in exchange for aid. For surely no one came without a price, not anymore. The human captain, a woman with lines of age across her face and eyes sharp as blades, spoke plainly. She said they had come because they had heard of a people abandoned and broken, and humanity did not turn away from those in need. She said they did not come to claim land or slaves, nor to profit from the Kareth suffering, but because leaving them to die while others looked away was something humans could not accept. The Kareth listened, but their hearts were heavy with disbelief. They had been promised salvation before, and every promise had turned to chains. Still, there was something different in the way these humans stood, not like predators circling prey, but like companions ready to share a burden. The captain ordered her crew to unload crates, and soon the Kareth saw food packed in sealed containers, medicine glowing with clean energy, and water purified beyond anything their machines could make. The children were the first to step forward, drawn by the sight of fruit they had never tasted and bread that smelled of warmth, and when they bit into it, their eyes widened with a light that had been long extinguished. In that moment something stirred among the Kareth, faint but real, like the first breath of wind after years of stillness. It was not trust, not yet, but it was something close, a fragile spark of hope. And though the galaxy had already written their name into the tomb of history, though the Council had sealed their fate, the Kareth realized that perhaps destiny was not finished with them. For the first time in countless years someone had come, and that someone was human. The human promise. The days after the humans arrived were filled with both wonder and fear among the Kareth. For though their children tasted food again and their sick were treated with medicine that soothed pain and broke fevers, the older ones could not let go of suspicion. Too many times before had strangers come with promises of salvation, only to bind the Kareth in chains or strip their lands further, and the idea that these new beings would give freely without demand felt like a dream that could not be real. Yet the humans did not withdraw. They did not leave after their crates were emptied. Instead, they began walking among the ruins, repairing broken pumps, setting up shelters, and speaking to the people as though they were not doomed, but worth saving. Each action chipped away at the wall of mistrust, though the wall stood strong and high. The Kareth elders confronted the human captain again, asking what she truly wanted, for no people risked the wrath of the Galactic Council without reason. The woman looked at them with a steady gaze and said that she wanted only to see life where there was death, that humanity had suffered too much in its own history to walk away from another race condemned to fade. She spoke of Earth, of wars and famines that nearly ended her kind, of plagues that tore through cities, and of how humans had always clawed their way back, even when the universe itself seemed determined to crush them. She said that the Kareth reminded her of those times and that humanity could not bear to stand idle while they were erased. Her words spread among the Kareth like fire in dry grass. Some scoffed and said she was a deceiver, that humans were no different from the rest and would soon reveal their true intent. Others whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, this time was different. The young listened most eagerly, for they had not lived through the betrayals of the past and their hearts were still soft enough to believe. Children followed the humans wherever they went, watching wide-eyed as they built strange machines that hummed with energy, or as they shared stories told in rough but honest voices. In those stories, the Kareth began to hear something they had forgotten, not just pity but respect. Still, the galaxy did not remain silent. Word traveled quickly across the trade lanes and the council chambers. Reports came that humans had defied the ruling and entered the Kareth system with supplies, ignoring warnings. Other races laughed at the foolishness, mocking humanity for wasting effort on a race marked for death. Some declared that humans sought to raise pets or slaves. Others claimed it was a trick to gain territory under the shadow of charity. The Kareth heard these whispers carried by traders who still passed through on secret routes, and with them came warnings that the humans would bring ruin down upon themselves and upon anyone who stood beside them. The captain and her crew heard these warnings too, yet they did not waver. Instead, they built stronger camps, erected tall antennae to call for more ships, and sent messages across human space calling for volunteers to come in aid. Soon other vessels followed, small transports filled with food, tools, and men and women who had left behind their homes to stand with strangers. Each landing brought more astonishment to the Kareth, who had never imagined that so many would come not for conquest but for the simple purpose of giving. They watched in silence as these humans shared laughter even in the poisoned air, as they worked until their hands were blistered, and as they treated Kareth children as though they were their own. But with this help came fear. Some Kareth warned the humans to leave before the council acted, for the wrath of the great empires could not be endured. They begged them to go, to save themselves while there was still time, but the captain only shook her head and said that humanity did not abandon its friends. Her words struck deeply, for the Kareth could not remember the last time another race had called them friends. Slowly, the elders began to see what their young already believed, that these humans were not playing a game of power, but following something within their hearts, something that could not be measured in trade or weighed in politics. At night, the Kareth sat by the fires once more, singing old songs that had been silent for generations. The humans listened quietly, and some even joined, their voices rough but sincere, blending with the alien tones into something new. It was in those nights that the first bonds were truly forged, bonds not of desperation but of shared spirit. Though fear still lingered and suspicion still whispered, A fragile bridge had been built, and across that bridge walked the first glimmer of trust. The galaxy had abandoned the Kareth, but humanity had not, and in that promise lay the seed of a future no one had dared to imagine. Seeds of hope. The days that followed began to change the face of the Kareth homeland in ways no one had dared to dream. For the humans worked with a strange mix of urgency and patience, as if they believed every life was worth the effort. Yet they never treated the Kareth as weak or helpless. Instead, they insisted on teaching them side by side. The first great task was to restore clean water to the city ruins. The old pumps had long been clogged with poisons and their filters broken beyond repair, but the humans brought machines that hummed with blue light and turned the foul liquid into clear streams. For the first time in decades, the Kareth drank without fear of sickness, and the simple act of lifting a cup of clean water felt like a miracle. Children splashed in the pools made by the pumps, their laughter carrying across the broken streets and causing even the most hardened elders to feel their eyes burn with tears. They had thought long-dried food came next, and with it, the return of strength to bodies that had been hollowed by years of hunger. The humans did not only hand out rations, they taught the Kareth how to plant crops in soil that had been considered dead, mixing it with strange powders and running lines of irrigation that brought life back to the ground. In small patches of green that sprouted among the gray dust, the Kareth saw not just survival but rebirth, and each sprouting leaf was like a promise that their children might see tomorrow brighter than today. Some of the younger Kareth began working side by side with human farmers, imitating their movements and learning their methods, and in return, humans listened with patience as the Kareth shared old songs of planting and harvest that had not been sung in generations. Two cultures began to weave together like threads, forming a stronger cloth. Trust did not come easily to all, yet it came slowly and firmly, as the humans never once asked for payment or obedience. They laughed and spoke as if the Kareth were equals. They shared meals and they sat in circles at night by the fires listening to stories of a people who had nearly lost everything. It was in those nights that Kareth children learned games from human children who had come aboard the supply ships, and their laughter together broke down barriers faster than any speech could. The elders watched in silence, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering that perhaps their gods had not abandoned them after all. Perhaps they had simply sent these strangers in their place. Yet the galaxy beyond their skies did not share this hope. From passing traders came rumors that the Council mocked humanity for their efforts, calling them wasteful dreamers who threw resources at the dying. Voices on other worlds asked why humans would burden themselves with a race that brought no wealth and no strategic power. The Kareth heard these words and fear crept back into their hearts, for they knew the wrath of the Council could not be ignored. Some urged the humans to leave while there was still time, to save themselves before punishment came. But the humans only answered with stubbornness, repeating again and again that they did not abandon those in need. One evening, as the red sun sank into the poisoned horizon, the Kareth gathered in the square of their ruined capital. There the human captain stood before them and spoke words that would be remembered for centuries. She told them that the galaxy may see them as lost, but humanity saw them as kin. She promised that as long as even one Kareth still drew breath, humans would stand beside them. Her voice carried across the silent crowd, and something deep inside the Kareth stirred, something that had been buried beneath years of despair. It was not only hope, it was pride. The first spark of pride that perhaps they were not yet finished, that perhaps their name would not vanish from the stars. That night the Kareth sang again. Not songs of mourning, but songs of their ancestors, songs of strength and defiance, songs that had been silent for too long. Humans joined, clapping their hands in rhythm, though the words were strange to them. The fires burned higher, the voices rose louder, and for the first time in generations, the Kareth looked not at the ground but at the sky. They began to believe that though the galaxy had turned away, though the Council had condemned them, they might yet rise again. And at the heart of that belief was not wealth, not power, but the simple truth that when all others had abandoned them, humanity had remained, rising from the ashes. The weeks became months, and with every passing day, the Kareth grew stronger under the steady hands of their human allies. Where once there had been only ruins and silence, there were now voices calling out in work and laughter, fields of crops stretching across the poisoned plains, and children running with joy that had not been seen for generations. The humans did, not simply give, but taught, and the Kareth began to remember how to build, how to plan, how to live as more than survivors. Broken machines were repaired, old factories were cleaned of the poisons that had claimed them, and in those places, the hum of energy returned. It was not the grandeur of the past, but it was the first step towards something new, a foundation built not on arrogance but on resilience. The Kareth themselves began to change in spirit. Once they had walked with bent shoulders and empty eyes, now they stood straighter. Their voices carried pride when they spoke, and their songs returned to the night skies. The humans had brought them food and water, but more than that, they had given them the strength to see themselves as worthy of life again. Warriors who had laid down their weapons now trained once more, not to conquer, but to defend what little they had rebuilt. Farmers returned to the soil with hope, artisans carved new designs, and the elders told stories no longer of endings but of beginnings. A people once marked for extinction was slowly rising from the ashes of their despair, yet as the Kareth rose, the eyes of the galaxy turned toward them with anger and suspicion. The council sent envoys bearing words of warning, declaring that humanity was interfering with decrees made long ago. They said that by lifting the Kareth from their decline, humans endangered the balance of power. They threatened sanctions, blockades, and punishments. But the humans answered with simple words that echoed across the stars. We do not abandon those who still breathe. These words spread like wildfire and inspired whispers in other forgotten corners of the galaxy. Whispers of hope that maybe humanity was different from the old powers who only valued profit and dominance. The council did not retreat. They tightened their grip, declaring that no supplies were to enter Kareth space, no ships were to land, and any who defied would face consequences. Traders who once visited in secret fled, afraid of losing their licenses or being hunted down. The Kareth watched with growing dread as the flow of goods slowed to a trickle, yet the humans remained. They brought what they could through hidden paths, their captains risking everything to land on the broken world. They shared every resource equally, their rations cut so that no Kareth child went hungry, while a human still had food in there. Packed through this hardship, a bond was forged that could not be broken. The Kareth who had once begged the humans to leave now stood beside them, declaring that if punishment came, it would be faced together. Villages were rebuilt not by one race, but by two working hand in hand. The young Kareth learned human words, and human children spoke Kareth songs, and in this exchange something greater was born than simple survival. It was unity, a unity that could not be bought or commanded by law, only given freely from the heart. The Kareth who once thought themselves lost began to believe they were chosen, not by gods or destiny, but by the will to endure and the refusal of their allies to walk away. They saw their ruins no longer as graves, but as places to be rebuilt. They looked upon their children and saw not the last generation, but the first of many more. And when they gazed at the humans who lived among them, they did not see strangers. They saw kin. The galaxy still mocked, the council still threatened, but deep inside the Kareth a fire had been lit, a fire that would not be easily extinguished. The people who had been abandoned by all others were rising once more, and with humanity beside them, they felt as though even the endless stars could not deny their place. The ruins were no longer a tomb but a forge, and within that forge the Kareth and the humans together began shaping a future the galaxy had never expected to see. The price of defiance. The blockade came slowly at first, a warning whispered across the stars. Then as iron walls closing around the Kareth system until no ship could pass without drawing the attention of the council fleets. Great vessels with banners of the empires took positions in orbit, their weapons glowing like eyes, filled with threat, and their messages repeated one command over and over. Abandon this place, abandon these people, abandon this cause. The humans aboard the supply ships knew what it meant. To stand their ground would bring them hunger, sickness, and perhaps death. Yet still they did not turn their engines away. They broadcast their answer openly for all to hear. Humanity does not walk away from those who trust us. And with those words they sealed their path on, the surface of the broken world, the Kareth felt the pressure tighten each day. Supplies dwindled as the blockade cut the lines, spare parts grew scarce, and every meal was shared, thinner until the portions seemed too small to sustain life. Yet no human ate more than a Kareth child. No crew member kept medicine while a Kareth elder suffered. Sacrifice was not demanded but given freely. And in that sharing, the bond between the two peoples grew deeper. The Kareth watched with astonishment as humans gave their last pieces of bread with a laugh, or patched wounds with their own hands even when their bodies were weary. Slowly, the Kareth began to imitate, offering their own meager stores to human friends, standing guard over human camps as if they were their own kin. The spirit of one had become the spirit of both. Fear spread with every passing day that the blockade would turn into war. Some Kareth elders begged the humans to leave before the council unleashed its wrath, their voices shaking with desperation, for they did not wish to see their only friends destroyed for a cause that seemed hopeless. But the captain answered, firmly, saying that the choice was already made, that to walk away now would be the true death of humanity's honor, and that life without honor was no life at all. These words struck the Kareth like thunder, for they had forgotten long ago what honor sounded like, and now they heard it spoken with a voice steady and unafraid. Children who had once grown up in despair now watched the humans train, and many of them began to train beside them, lifting wooden spears, running across the plains, shouting with voices filled with a pride their parents thought had been lost forever. Farmers turned their tools into weapons when they were not tending the crops. Artisans carved blades from steel once rusting in the ruins, and warriors who had abandoned hope sharpened their swords again, not for conquest, not for glory, but for the promise that no matter what the council sent, they would not kneel again without a fight. This change was not forced by humans. It rose within the Kareth themselves. But it was the presence of humanity that gave them courage to remember they were not yet gone. As days grew into weeks, the skies filled with the shadows of council ships, their numbers swelling, their weapons humming, but the Kareth and the humans stood firm. In the camps at night they shared fires still, telling each other stories to keep fear at bay. The humans spoke of old Earth battles when their ancestors had stood against overwhelming odds, when nations had fallen yet people had endured, and the Kareth listened with wide eyes and steady hearts, drawing strength from tales of resilience that sounded so much like their own. In return, the Kareth sang their ancient war chants, their voices deep and powerful, shaking the night air with echoes of who they once had been. The price of defiance was hunger, it was fear, it was the looming threat of annihilation, yet none bent their knee. The galaxy mocked from afar, the council roared with threats. But upon that broken world, two peoples stood side by side as one, sharing every burden, every fear, every hope. And in the silence of the stars beyond the blockade there began to grow whispers that the council might have made a mistake. For when you threaten to erase a people and those who protect them, you do not always meet silence. Sometimes you awaken a fire that cannot be controlled. The turning point. The council expected the Kareth to collapse under the pressure of the blockade. They expected hunger to break their will and fear to scatter their courage. Yet what they found instead was a people who stood taller each day and a human presence that refused to fade. In the shadows of the orbiting fleets, the Kareth began to rediscover the warrior spirit that had once made them feared across the stars. With the guidance of human engineers, they reforged their ancient weapons into tools of defense, converting old factories into forges that rang with the sound of steel once more. The humans showed them how to repair their broken ships, how to arm them with new strength, and soon the skies above their ruined cities buzzed with small craft ready to defend their homes. It began when raiders hired by the council descended, believing they would find an easy prize. They came expecting weakness, but what they found was resistance like they had never imagined. Kareth warriors armed with blades, bows, and newly reforged rifles fought beside humans wielding weapons of their own, and the ground shook with the roar of battle. Children hid in the shelters as the clash rang out. But when they emerged, they saw their fathers and mothers standing victorious over the broken machines of the raiders. Word spread quickly across the stars. The Kareth were not only alive, they were fighting back, and they were not alone. The image of humans and Kyreth standing shoulder to shoulder became a symbol the Council could not ignore. For the Kyreth, this battle was more than survival. It was a rebirth of pride. No longer did they see themselves as victims waiting for the mercy of others. Now they stood as warriors again, defending not only their lives but their right to exist. They trained day and night, their young learning from both the old Kyreth ways and the strange but effective human tactics. Humans spoke of strategy, of discipline, of standing firm even when outnumbered, and the Kyreth absorbed these lessons eagerly. In return, the Kyreth taught the humans their songs of war, their chants that once echoed through the stars, and when the two peoples raised their voices together, it felt as though the very ground trembled with their unity. The Council tried to hide the reports, but whispers cannot be silenced forever. Across the galaxy, oppressed peoples heard that a doomed race had risen again, that the Kyreth had stood against raiders and won, and that humanity had fought beside them without asking for reward. This was not the story of weakness that the Council wanted to spread. This was the story of defiance, and it began to light fires in places they thought long controlled. In back rooms and hidden colonies, others began to wonder if perhaps the old powers could be challenged, if perhaps humanity was the spark that would burn away centuries of fear. On the ground, the price was heavy, for every battle left scars. Every raid cost lives, and every victory brought grief alongside triumph. Yet the Kyreth did not falter. When one fell, another rose. When a ship was destroyed, its parts were gathered to build something new. When hunger gnawed at their stomachs, they sang to drown out the ache. The humans remained at their side, through it all refusing to retreat, even when they knew more powerful fleets were gathering in the dark. Their resolve became a shield, and the Kyreth drew strength from it as if it were a weapon itself. The turning point was not a single victory, but the realization that together they could endure what neither could survive alone. The Kyreth found within themselves the will they thought lost, and humanity proved that compassion was stronger than fear. The Council had believed their decree was final, that abandonment meant extinction. Yet here, on this scarred world, the Kyreth were proving them wrong. The galaxy was beginning to see that where cruelty and indifference had failed, the stubborn heart of humanity had succeeded, and so the Kyreth stood with their allies, battered but unbroken, scarred but proud, ready for whatever storm was coming, knowing now that they were not forgotten, and never would be again as long as humanity still drew breath beside them. Humanity's legacy. The blockade had lasted longer than anyone expected, and the Council's fleets had grown restless, for they had come to believe that by cutting supplies and surrounding the Kyreth world, they would force surrender, but instead the opposite had taken place. The Kyreth no longer waited for mercy and no longer prayed for pity. They had risen with the stubborn help of their human allies and had turned despair into fire. Each day that passed became proof that abandonment could not erase them, and the Council soon realized that their decree had created not silence, but defiance. When the Council finally gathered its fleets to strike, believing they would crush the Kyreth in one final show of force, they were met with something they had not imagined. The Kyreth ships, once broken relics, now flew again with human engineers patching their cores and Kyreth pilots guiding them with steady hands. On the ground, the cities once in ruin now glowed with new lights, defenses built from scraps, but powered by determination. And the people who had been starving shadows now stood as warriors with blades and rifles in their hands. And beside them the humans, not as conquerors but as kin, ready to bleed for a people not their own. The Council fleets advanced with fire and thunder, but the Kyreth and humans fought back with a unity that no empire could command. The battle raged for days, the skies above burning with streaks of fire, and though the Kyreth forces were small, they fought with the fury of a people who refused extinction. Humanity's stubborn refusal to leave inspired every Kyreth fighter, and when ships fell from the sky, survivors were pulled from the wreckage and sent back into the fight. The Council expected fear but found only courage. They expected surrender, but found only resolve. In the end, the fleets withdrew, not because they were destroyed, but because the cost of crushing this world had become greater than they were willing to pay. And across the galaxy, the message was clear. The Kyreth lived, and they lived because humanity had refused to abandon them. After the battle, there was silence. Not the silence of death, but the silence of triumph. The Kareth gathered in their rebuilt square, the fires burning high, and there they carved into stone the promise that had carried them through. They carved the symbol of humanity beside their own, declaring that when all others had turned away, when even the stars seemed to have closed their light, the humans had remained. Children ran through the crowd shouting songs of two peoples now bound as one. Elders lifted their hands and wept not from sorrow but from pride, and the warriors stood with their blades raised high. It was not victory over an empire, it was victory over despair, and that was greater than any conquest. The galaxy could no longer call them extinct, no longer mock them as lost. Instead, whispers spread of the Kareth reborn and of humanity, the stubborn allies who had changed their fate. Other races watched with cautious hope, some dreaming that they too might rise if ever they found the courage to stand as the Kareth had stood. And in this way, humanity's legacy stretched beyond one broken world. It became a spark that reached into the darkest corners of the galaxy in the years that followed. The Kareth rebuilt their cities with human help, planting gardens where ash once lay, raising towers where ruins had crumbled, and teaching their children to walk with heads held high. Humans remained among them, not as rulers but as friends, their families living side by side, their songs blending into one voice. Together they forged a future that no decree could erase and no blockade could end. The Kareth were no longer alone, and humanity had shown the galaxy a truth greater than power or wealth, that compassion and stubborn loyalty could reshape destiny itself. And so the story of the forgotten race who had been left to die became the story of a people who rose again, and at the heart of that story stood humanity, a race new to the stars, but carrying within them a spirit that refused to abandon hope. It was a spirit that lit a fire in the Kareth hearts and carved a new chapter in the history of the galaxy. And when the songs of the Kareth were sung, the name of humanity was always carried with honor, for it was humanity that had remained when all others had gone. The galaxy had believed the Kareth finished, and the Council had written them into the pages of extinction. But history does not always obey the powerful, and the story of this forgotten people was not destined to end in silence. From the ashes of despair they had risen, and beside them stood humanity, a race dismissed as reckless and naive yet revealed as fierce and loyal beyond measure. What began as the gift of food and water became something greater than survival. It became a bond stronger than the blockade of fleets and stronger than the weight of galactic decrees. The Kareth found themselves walking once again as a people who believed they had a place among the stars, and they knew that this rebirth would never have been possible, if not for the stubborn hearts of their human allies. The Council had tried to smother them with hunger and fear, but instead, they had awakened defiance. The battle that came did not end in conquest or empire, but in proof. Proof that those marked for death could fight back. Proof that loyalty between peoples could not be broken by threats or chains. When the Council fleets withdrew in frustration, leaving the Kareth world scarred but unbroken, the galaxy watched in awe. They had expected a funeral song. Instead, they heard the anthem of a people reborn. The Kareth looked upon their human brothers and sisters and declared them kin, not by blood but by choice, a choice sealed in hardship and sacrifice. From that day forward, the Kareth carried not only their own symbols, but also the mark of humanity carved into their stones and their monuments. They told their children of the time when the galaxy turned away, and only the humans remained. They sang songs of two peoples standing shoulder to shoulder. They taught that despair could be defeated by courage, and that abandonment could be answered with loyalty. And humanity in turn carried the story of the Kareth across their colonies, reminding their children that compassion was not weakness, and that the greatest victories were not measured in territory, but in lives saved and friendships. Forged generations later, the tale was still told in the halls of both races, not as a legend but as truth carved into memory. The Kareth no longer whispered of dying gods. Instead, they spoke of the day humans came through poisoned skies and gave them back their pride. And when their ships sailed into the stars again, they carried banners woven with two emblems. For their future was no longer theirs alone, but shared with the friends who had refused to abandon them. The Council could issue decrees and threats, but they could never erase what had been created in fire and sacrifice. a bond that had turned despair into strength and silence into song. Thus the Kareth endured, thus humanity proved itself, and thus the galaxy learned that compassion can be more powerful than fear, that loyalty can be stronger than fleets, and that sometimes the greatest story begins when everyone else has given up. For when all had turned away, humanity had remained, and in that choice a people were saved and a legacy was born that would shine across the stars forever. The end.